British politics has long had a big money problem.
October 94, cash for questions. Tim Smith fell on his sword.
But something has changed. The sums are bigger, the donors are fewer, and the public has grown incensed at a political system they feel is not working for them.
We're in an arms race, and we're in an arms race with no guardrails.
We saw the 2024 election, the biggest, most expensive election. If that keeps happening, then there is this sort of ratcheting up effect and political parties saying, well, we need the money.
This series is about what that money is doing to our political system. Because when political influence is for sale, the principle that every person's vote counts equally starts to look a bit like polite fiction.
Often we think of democracy as just we vote, we elect people, they do stuff. But actually behind that, there's a whole separate machinery that has to be paid for. If you're one of those people who does the paying, you inevitably end up with a degree of influence that goes beyond the people who just do the voting. And that is the concern. How do you prevent those hidden donors from essentially taking over the whole process and turning voting into a farce?
Has there been a meaningful shift, do you think, in the scale of money in politics, or has this always been a big problem?
The political parties between them and their candidates spent about £90 million on the election, which itself was a lot more than it had done in previous elections, partly because the government the year before had increased the spending limits to let them spend far more money.
The concern about money in politics actually isn't new. So back in 2011, Ed Miliband said we've got to have a cap of £5,000 to get big money out of politics.
We've got to change the way we fund politics, and we've got to take the big money out of politics. Why do I say that? When people don't vote for the mainstream parties, it's because they believe, look, politics can't change my life. Part of the reason they think that is that politics is not being run in their interests.
There's been a real acceleration of not just the volume of money in politics, but also the concentration of where it comes from. A smaller and smaller number of ultra-wealthy donors.
But I think what you've seen is this growth of money at the same time that you've seen a shrinking of any political will to do anything about it.
When we say that political donations buy influence, what do we mean? Are we talking about policy? Are we talking about access? Are we talking about the opportunity to influence government? What do we mean by that?
It can mean a few things. I think it can mean that you have a direct number to call if something comes up and you want to influence. It can mean you have the constant air of a politician.
Part is about reputation. Some people are donating because they want to be seen rubbing shoulders with politicians. It's a kind of status symbol. But I think the real risk is that this is also about buying up the policies of an incoming government.
When I was still in the Labour Party, and I'm sure this is true for other political parties too, that big donors would be invited to special briefings, have special meetings. This sense of closed door access was definitely there.
Money has always shaped politics. And in some ways, it's part of the reason democracy exists in the first place. To give ordinary people an equal voice to those with wealth and power. But the money in politics is at an historic high. But that's only half the story. Zoom in and an even more troubling picture emerges. This money isn't coming from thousands of party members or small donors wanting to back their local candidate. It's coming from a shrinking pool of extraordinary wealthy individuals donating sums that most of us can barely imagine.
The Observer has just released a 4-part investigative series which we've done in partnership with The Rest is Politics. It's called Who Funds Reform? And it looks back over both Nigel Farage's career over the years, the friends that he's made and sometimes the enemies along the way. But really what we try to focus on is the money. The relationship between Nigel Farage and Christopher Harborne is perhaps one of the things that is most fascinating. They are two very different characters. Nigel Farage, obviously a big showman, loves being in front of the camera. Christopher Harborne, very much the opposite, stays in the shadows. My interest in Christopher Harborne came about before his involvement with Reform, when we discovered that he had given £1 million to the office of Boris Johnson. That was, at the time, the single biggest donation to an individual politician, outgoing politician. And that was when we discovered that Christopher Harborne had a sort of Thai alias, Chakrit Sankakrit, and that his wealth had come from crypto. So we knew that he was a very wealthy man. We knew that he had donated to the Brexit Party some years before and the Conservatives, but in a sort of relatively, what I would say, quote unquote, normal level, a few thousands here and there. And it wasn't until last year when we saw the £9 million that he'd given to Reform that he was just propelled into an entirely new level.
But this is not just a story about reform. Labour's recent experiences tell its own version of the same story. Before the last election, it was reported that Labour Together failed to declare donations worth over £700,000, and that the party itself received £4 million from a hedge fund whose parent company is registered in the Cayman Islands. The Labour Together story, I think, is a story that tells us a lot about how politics works increasingly in Britain and the role of money in our politics. So Labour Together was set up around 2015 in the wake of Jeremy Corbyn's win of the Labour leadership contest. And there was a lot of people on various wings of the party who weren't happy about that result. And a lot of donors who weren't happy as well. So Labour's, a lot of big Labour donors stopped giving money to the party. But what they started doing was actually funding this thing called Labour Together. And initially Labour Together, I think, was kind of closer to a think tank, it was producing policy papers. But under Morgan McSweeney, who took it over, it became very much a political campaign. And the money that Labour Together was taking in from its donors was really important for a bunch of reasons. One was it was funding this political activity, but two, and quite importantly, it wasn't been declared to the Electoral Commission, a lot of it. When journalists started reporting on these undeclared donations in 2023, Labour Together hired a PR firm called APCO Worldwide to investigate and effectively to discredit these journalists.
When the report came in, Labour Together were quite happy to talk about its conclusions widely around Westminster, claim that the Sunday Times was being used by the Russian state, which is the most absurd thing I've ever heard.
This material was brought to the Security Service, the National Cyber Security Centre, by Labour Together with the suggestion that it had all been a product of a Russian hack. None of this was true, none of this had any basis in fact. But it meant that these stories about Labour Together didn't really circulate into the public domain. And where a lot of political actors, including donors, are well known to the media and have kind of contacts there, it means we're in a position where often some of these stories about political funding, about how political funding shapes our politics and shapes our politics in ways we can't see, can end up going unreported. I think we see a lot of political funding scandals. And one of the reasons I sort of doing the work I did was you see them crest, they happen and then they kind of retreat. And then there's another one, and everyone can often feel like they flare up on their own. But do you think that those sort of scandals, are they changing the political conversation, or do they just become like kind of little isolated episodes that exist and flare up and then disappear again?
I think the challenge with all the scandals that we have and the things that you've been exposing is to make sure that they feed into a constructive conversation and not just a cynical conversation, but instead to channel concern and anger about it in the direction of better rules and better enforcement of those rules.
I mean, it's very difficult because it requires you to sort of either be in the room or to know people who are in the room. And usually people who are in the room are there because they are trusted lieutenants, and they're not necessarily the ones that are going to spill their guts to what they might consider a hostile journalist. And so often it is about looking at patterns and seeing where the patterns form. And so there is a degree of allowing people to join the dots for themselves. And, our job is to find the facts. And sometimes you don't find all the facts. You just have to kind of, set out what you have.
This is a story of extremely wealthy individuals using their considerable wealth to fund political parties. But really, it's a story about a system that allows, and arguably invites, this to happen. A system without donation caps is a system where dependency is a logical destination. And a political class that depends on that money will always be susceptible to accusations, fair or not, of weighing up what is in Britain's best interests against those of their donors. The public have noticed, and what that is doing to their trust in politics is what we'll look at next.